our dear Patrick McCauley, co-founder of the conference itself. And his talk today is called Poignant Nostalgia for My Abandoned Faith, Leaving Some Former Interpretations of Harry Potter Behind. It's Patrick McCauley.
You may know that somebody bailed out of the conference, and I was asked to produce something in the last few hours. So please forgive me whatever inaccuracies become to your consciousness in the next couple of minutes. Okay. I can remember with vivid clarity a moment, I was probably about 11, when I encountered a wonderful Saturday evening post painting by Norman Rockwell framed on the wall of my grandparents' house. I was overwhelmed with what was for me the undeniable beauty of Rockwell's ability to create a moving narrative within the borders of a still image. I just couldn't believe that some human being could put something like this together out of nothing. The aesthetic effect on me was close to overwhelming, and it made so much of the art I was consuming at the time, sitcoms and pop radio, look pale and two-dimensional in comparison. I imagined myself into the world and the story of that painting, and I walked around in there for days and days. I would spend the next few years creating my own versions of narrative sketches under the distinct impression that the mere attempt to follow this inspiration was itself a majestic ambition. Years later, my wife Catherine and I were driving back to Philadelphia through a snowstorm from the University of Iowa while listening to the Christmas episode of A Prairie Home Companion. One of that show's segments was called Low Art. Garrison Keillor sang a somewhat funny song about how pedestrian Norman Rockwell's art was. I seem to recall that he wasn't really mocking Rockwell, just assigning it to a certain strata in the artistic hierarchy. I was a graduate student at the time, and I knew exactly what Keeler was getting at. I got the joke. But I also felt an echo from somewhere. My 11-year-old self, that one who had spent hours filling his geometry notebook with sketches and graphic narrative ideas, did not get the joke at all. How could Rockwell's art be seen as bad or low? I mean, anyone could see how much care, authenticity, and respect the artist magicked into the depiction of a little girl holding an injured doll up to an oh so patient doctor. I'm sure you can see there is irony here at a few different levels. If you know the Rockwell image that has often been hung on the walls of children's doctors' offices, the 5-year-old girl holds the doll to the doctor with utter seriousness while the doctor almost rolls his eyes while holding a stethoscope to the doll. The little girl is taking things quite seriously, while most of the audience understands things from the doctor's accommodating point of view. However, after having seen the picture at her own doctor's office, my sister brought her own doll to get checked out on our next visit. She also took the whole thing very seriously, and so did our doctor. My mother thanked him profusely. There was a teacher, Mrs. Regan, who was, in my world, universally recognized as the toughest and most demanding of all the teachers in the 1978 Junior High School of Wakefield, Massachusetts. If you chose to take her class, you knew what you were getting yourself into. I was not sure I really belonged in there. She was an English teacher after all, and I was a science and math kid. I was also mildly dyslexic and could only read about 5 pages an hour. It hasn't changed much. For homework, Mrs. Regan had us read the lyrics to the Beatles song Eleanor Rigby. When we got into class the next day, we became immersed into a group discussion and analysis of the various levels of meaning and relevance that could be seen within the plot, images, and metaphors of that piece. I was transfixed at the popcorn contribution from all the voices of the class. Everyone had something to say. Everyone seems to have seen something interesting, something I hadn't seen on my own, but I could understand once somebody had voiced it. I would eventually abandon a career in engineering and science in order to commit my entire professional life, to the humanities. This would cause a permanent rift between my scientific father and myself. The courage and determination to turn toward the humanities can, without question, be traced to what I experienced in Mrs. Regan's class that day. I had never seen anything so relevant and magical as a group exploration of subjectively discovered meaning emerging out of an encounter with a work of art. Why, I thought, both then and now, would anyone choose to live without that? Between that year and this, I have spent exactly one semester outside of the academic context, outside of the context of a shared discussion of art. The thought of that semester still sends shivers. It shall not be repeated. If you don't see me in one of those settings, you will know that I have died. The 14 years of the annual Harry Potter academic conference at Chestnut Hill College stands as a testimony to this. In 1981, I made friends with Sandy M., the one and only evangelical Christian in my high school. If you are not aware, evangelical Christians were rare in 1981 and very rare in suburban Boston. There were punk kids in that high school, but none of them were the rebels that Sandy was. Her, her dedication to her authentic and ferocious faith allowed her to be the most solidly individual and self creating person I had ever met in my life to that point. She stood as a moving example of that thoughtless submission to the status quo was a shameful joke, an outcome to be avoided at all cost. She felt that one's immortal soul hung in the balance. It probably does. She inspired me to second guess every single capitulation to my culture I was at risk of allowing. She was not evangelical to be part of an accepting clique. She was not evangelical to acquire easy afterlife safe harbor. She was not evangelical in order to judge anyone other than herself. She was not an evangelical to find easy and convenient answers to complex questions. Her turn to the evangelicalism was her tool to call herself to accept and commit herself to a life of seriousness, bravery, integrity, and purpose. I've known only a few evangelicals like her. They do not call much attention to themselves. I have also known people who were once evangelicals for all the reasons listed just previously. These particular people have often been all too willing to admit to me that during that period, while they saw themselves as evangelical, they were largely motivated from some sense that they themselves were going to get something tangible for their participation. In other words, they see that their version of that faith in retrospect, and they see that for them it had been largely acquisitional. This will likely come as little surprise to those who are critical of this form of popular Christianity. However, it is also true that some of the people like this have come to understand that they used evangelicalism as a stage within the process of their own individual development. They will often assert that they could not have become the person who will eventually leave the now regretted faith behind without having arrived and developed there in the first place. Where they are now as a person is without question at least partially grounded on who they were and became while they lived within that previous, often long-lasting stage. Only a fool, it might be said, too easily and vigorously dismisses a previous personal stage of development without admitting and acknowledging that one's current identity rests completely and utterly on the phoenix ashes of my former identities. Moses Maimonides was a world important Jewish writer from the Middle Ages. His most famous work is called Guide for the Perplexed. In that book, it might be said that he argued that perhaps the most ingenious aspect or characteristic of the Hebrew Bible was its carefully crafted ability to meet the reader at the reader's own developmental stage. For the child, it becomes a book for a child. For a teenager, it becomes the book for the perplexed teenager. This teenager will then eventually abandon this once relied upon work, thereby allowing it to be reconstituted later as the book in a desperate young parent will find themselves reflected within. In other words, it has been the case for quite some time that there are many who seek not for one specific and authoritative reading of a holy text like the Hebrew Bible, but for remarkably many. Such people might say that it can't really be holy if it speaks with only one message for everyone. It is holy when it speaks to you with the message that you need. How many attending this conference are here, at least in part, because they found such a thing when they were reading the Harry Potter series at some point or another? The philosophical theologians Soren Kierkegaard and Keiji Nishitani both assert that the most important truths are the ones that strike you at the most powerfully personal and internal levels. The way we feel about things that matter the most to us come from a part of us that is so private and internal it is unshareable, unrevealable. That is one of the reasons we love poetry and lyrics so much. Poems are courageous attempts to allow access into the internal and the private. They do not really get there, of course, but we appreciate when people try. External, uh, external shareable truths will not help when you are trying to figure out whether you should ask a specific person to marry you, whether or not to join the military, whether or not to have a baby, whether or not to choose a major, whether or not to get a divorce, whether or not to sign a DNR, whether or not to willingly walk into the forbidden forest in order to voluntarily allow Tom Riddle to kill you. When I was growing up, the Sunday comics were one of the relatively few parts of pop culture that was amenable to children. The comics felt a little like the part of the newspaper that was like those water fountains at the mall that were mounted at kid height. One of my favorite comics was the 80 in the from the 80s was created by Lynn Johnston and was called For Better or For Worse. In my understanding, it was perhaps the first comic strip in which the characters in her world grew older and then grew up. This decision made this strip much more dynamic and engrossing when compared with those strips in which Dennis the Menace, for example, never ever gets one day older. Dennis the Menace never ever takes one step toward development or maturation. Marmaduke never gets older either, but Lynn Johnston's characters do. How important is that? Recently, a colleague and I used Disney's Encanto in class. We used it because the film works at two levels. In the first go through, we look at the film in the way that most people do. There is an initial threat to the family, but magic steps in and saves the day. Our students love this interpretation, and the class discussion is quite animated and robust. However, anyone who has seen the film knows the initial father figure is killed by marauders, the bad kind. Why do they not kill everyone else? In 1890, Ambrose Bierce published a famous short story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Anyone who's read this story knows that there is a twist. Originally, we see a Civil War prisoner escaping from an attempt to hang him. The rope just breaks and he gets away. However, as the story winds toward its conclusion, we discover that the entire plot after the rope break never actually happened. The entire story was invented in the mind of the just about to be hanged man in the time it takes to fall from the bridge to the tightened rope. The escape is a fantasy. The death was real. Is Encanto a story like that? Is the survival of the family the last minute fantasy of the mother who holds her three beloved children in the face of ruthless marauders? The ending of Lewis Lowery's The Giver might also be seen as another example of this kind of literary device. At the end of that work, the characters Jonas and Gabriel approach what can appear to be the border while being threatened with hypothermia. With his curious apparent ability to, quote, see beyond, unquote, they acquire a sled at the top of a hill and ride it to safety in the Christmas warmth of a home in a waiting, welcoming village. I have talked to many adults who, having read the story as a child, still see the ending this way. I, however, read the book as an adult and as a person who has experienced severe hypothermia once. I know what it feels like to go through that, and it was not hard to recognize similar characteristics in this depiction of at the end of The Giver. In my adult reading, the Jonah character, of course, does not survive. He dies of hypothermia while existing in a hallucination. Children do not and perhaps should not see this ending. Adults usually have no choice but to see this ending. Lowry creates an ending within which the age of the reader in part determines which of the endings is perceived or received. J.K. Rowling had a wonderful relative who gave her a copy of Jessica Mitford's Huns and Rebels when she, Rowling, was at the age that most children first read Harry Potter. It was a formative book for her in all accounts. Within it, Mitford describes her own child's perception of her sister's marriage. After the wedding, young Jessica finds that her sister, Diana, has become much less fun. This irritates the young Jessica, and she demotes Diana from her status as favorite sister. However, the adults reading this portion of the book that is related from the point of view of the child Jessica, it is not hard to recognize the effects of domestic abuse or violence in Diana's post wedding state of mind. We here all know of the near constant references to violence against girls and women in the Harry Potter series. However, they are often veiled in the earlier books in a deference to the maturity level of the expected readers. It is not until the very last novel that we are actually shown the murder of Helena Ravenclaw by her resisted suitor, the Bloody Baron, who has killed her with a knife, not a wand. Just like Mitford and Lowry, Rowling aesthetically respects the developing maturity of her expected readers and reveals violence only when it is psychologically safer to do so. But this is to look at the development and maturation of characters from the outside looking in. But the great magic of novels is their ability to reveal the inner thoughts and private emotions of specific characters. Much of the magic of the Harry Potter series serves to reveal the true inner thoughts and feelings of characters within the story. The Boggart reveals my true fears to everyone in the room, and the Mirror of Erised reveals to me my own true desires of my soul. Novels are that kind of magic. They reveal the inner. They reveal the inner, even though the inner cannot be revealed. They are magic. Eleanor Rigby is magic. Through the novel's magical ability to reveal the subjective inner, moral motives can be directly addressed. Having been given access to the inner thoughts and motives of Harry Potter, at least, we can watch as his inner thoughts and motives develop and advance. Like, for better or for worse, Harry and the other characters grow up through the novels. They are remarkably different from one book to the next, and they are certainly different from the first book to the last. Harry is the character whose inner thoughts we can see the most. Why might that be? The connection between the story of Harry Potter and the story of Jesus of Nazareth, as represented in the canonical Gospels, is fairly widely known. One of my favorite depictions of Jesus of Nazareth is the one that appears in the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar. In particular, I continually return to the Garden of Gethsemane scene in that work. There, that interpretation of Jesus shows him as scared and despairing. He seems there to be on the edge of giving up, just as he faces a painful and voluntary death. Herman Hesse said near the end of his own life that for him, almost all of Christianity orbits around Gethsemane as the story's gravitational center. There we see Jesus marshaling his determination, but it is not clear how or why he really does it. If you really wanted to know how someone could emotionally and morally mature to the point that they could, in reality, make such a choice, you would have to know how they had arrived at that level. You would have to know perhaps every moral decision they had made before they had arrived at this final challenge. If you didn't care how such a choice is possible, then you wouldn't have to ask. If you do want to know, then you will have to ask. But once you find out, you will likely never be able to forget or disregard that answer. Here we are at the last page. Albus Dumbledore waits until very late in the series to reveal tough secrets to Harry about his connection to Tom Riddle. This is perhaps, at least in part, a reference to the need for a careful and compassionate timing when it comes to moral and intellectual development. The same reference exists in Encanto, The Giver, and Huns and Rebels. In fact, it is not until the very moment that Harry has to walk into the forest that the requirement to voluntarily sacrifice himself as a, quote, pig for slaughter is revealed through Snape's tears in the Pensieve. The phoenix is a central image and theme in the Harry Potter series. Something new rises from the ashes. There is a tendency in our culture to make top 10 lists of every kind. We always want to know which is the number one hit, which is the number one university, which is the greatest painting of all time. Well, the number one hit is the one that you like most. The number one college is the one that fits for you. The number one painting is the one that knocks you right out of your socks, like Van Gogh did to me in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris in 1997. But I could only see the shimmering presentation of the ineffable divine in Van Gogh's olive trees if I had earlier begun to see something else, but something akin, in Rockwell when I was 11. Last paragraph. There is no point in disparaging literature, art, or religion as childish or low. Be careful of doing so, for someone in earshot can be in the process of finding themselves in it. You did, and so did I. Your disparagement has the dark power to rob the art of its magic for that person who hears you and needs it. In the gospel story, we get one line in which that character asks, quote, "Take this cup from me," unquote, as the expression of what he is going through and how he feels. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, we get about 6 paragraphs and the Resurrection Stone to let us have some idea about how Harry feels and what he is going through. But in reality, the Harry Potter series grants us access into all the inner thoughts and developments that have ushered Harry to this point. Every thought and every development. You can, if you wish, see it like the version of The Giver in which Jonah and Gabriel make it to a warm, wonderfully safe setting. Or, if you wish, you can see it as the answer to the question about how someone learns to be able to empty their entire life into a cause or a purpose that is worth that. How do you become the person who can step up to the podium and give an I have a dream speech while being fundamentally aware that someone has crosshairs on your forehead the entire time? If you wanted to know the answer to that question, you would have to know every stage of moral development that has led to that moment. If you wanted to know the answer to that question, you would have to decide to see it. You would have to want to see it. Thank you very much.